Hi, Gary.
Hi, Carl.
So my name is Carl Zimmer, and I'm a science writer. And Gary, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Gary Marcus, and I'm a professor at New York University, and I also do some science writing as well.
So Gary is first-time blogging header. I've been on a few times, and I am really interested to talk to Gary today because I've known him for a few years, and there have been slowly a lot of questions that have been kind of accumulating in my head about his work on the brain and the mind and language and reasoning and all sorts of big stuff. So let's see how much we can rip through in this time we have here. So Gary, I should point out, has the author of two books, both of which I am happy to say I own. I'm going to hold one up to the camera. It's called The Birth of the Mind. This came out in 2004. The subtitle is How a Tiny Number of Genes Creates the Complexities of Human Thought. And his new book, which I also have and recommend, is called Kluge. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Gary?
That's right, Kluge. Rhymes with stooge.
Rhymes with stooge. The haphazard construction of the human mind. And we'll get to the definition of a kludge shortly. But, so Gary, I'm really curious how someone winds up just dedicating their lives to probing, deep questions of the mind. And you mentioned that kind of started, I guess, for you in high school. You were trying to create some sort of, what was it, like a Latin translator or something like that? You were
That's right.
interested in language already?
I got into all these sort of big questions about the mind by starting with sort of big questions about computers. So I was an early addict to computers, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. By the time I was 10, I was already trying to do some computer programming. And I went to a summer program called the Center for Talented Youth in junior high school, and I took a computer programming class there and I took a cognitive psychology class there. And afterwards, one of the first things that I guess I did research-wise in cognitive science was I tried to build a computer program that would translate Latin into English. And it sort of worked, and it sort of didn't. I got a semester's worth of Latin in there, so it could sort of find the nominative case and find the accusative case given a limited vocabulary.
Wow. What kind of computer were you working on?
That was a Commodore 64, and the language of choice was Logo. Lisp would have been really the right language to write it in, but I don't think you could even get it on a Commodore 64. So I wrote it all in Logo, and it worked well enough that it helped me get into college after 10th grade, which was I think a good thing for me. But it wasn't like it really understood Latin, and so I was aware both of what was good about it and also what was true of its limitations. And that kind of got me hooked on the mind. Like I had this fantasy that I was going to write, database programs that you could interact with in natural language or something like that. And I realized as I was doing this computer programming how hard it would really be to do that. And then I went off to college and I studied cognitive science. Not everybody may know that field by name. It's not like a household word, but it relates to something you said before about sort of big questions across a lot of disciplines. That's a field that's all about how to understand the mind using whatever tools you can get, whether it be from psychology or philosophy or linguistics or biology. And that's really what my career has been about since college, has been trying to look at all these different fields and how they tie together and what they can tell us together about the mind. So in college, I mostly worked on human reasoning, and I mentioned a little bit of it in the new book, one of my own studies there.
You mentioned this experiment you did in college where you basically were tricking people about what was it was something about let me remember about firemen, right?
Yeah. So
maybe you could describe that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this was part of. I went to a place called Hampshire College, and we didn't have theses, but basically it was my bachelor's thesis. We called it Division 3 there. And my bachelor's thesis was looking at how people accumulate evidence and what they sort of do with that evidence. Do they keep track of where it comes from and so forth? And so the particular experiment was asking people, let me take a step back. The particular experiment told people these little vignettes about some research that said that firefighting was either positively linked to risk-taking ability or negatively. So some people read that this recent study had said that to be a good firefighter, basically you have to take risks, and there are strong statistical correlations with some measure of risk-taking and how good a firefighter you are. And other people got the opposite. And then what was interesting was then people either had a chance to think about that, or they were sort of kept busy with something like an IQ test where they had little geometrical shapes and they had to sort of match the shape and so forth. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I told them that the original study was bogus. I had just made it up. That was just, I can't remember exactly what the cover story was, but I said that it wasn't true. And then I said, what I want to know is, what do you really think? Do you really think that firefighting is related to risk-taking ability? And the people that were kept busy were like, well, I guess I don't really know. I mean, they had to judge like on a 7-point scale, and they sort of expressed lack of confidence. The people who had time to make up their own reasons became convinced of whatever they had time to make up their own reasons for. So then they decided, if they were in the group that heard that firefighting and risk-taking were positively correlated, then even after they heard that the original evidence was bogus, they were still convinced of that because they had made up their own reasons to believe it. And of course, the control is people that were told the opposite, and they believed what they had time to think about. So that tells us that we lose track of why we believe the things that we do, and we can't keep track of sort of what's good external evidence as opposed to our own self-justification. So that was, I guess I've never thought about it until this moment when you're asking me, but I guess that was my first real hint that the mind is a kludge, that we're doing some pretty clumsy things. I didn't think about it in those terms. I was sort of narrowly focused on the particular phenomena, but really that is kind of a first step towards realizing how clumsy the mind is. And in fact, a chapter of the book is about belief, and a lot of that grows out of the stuff that I learned as an undergraduate and research.
Yeah, I should mention, before we'll jump into the kludge later, but the definition of a kludge is a clumsy or inelegant solution to a problem, and I guess it's interesting to me that you wrote this book after The Birth of the Mind, because in The Birth of the Mind, you're talking about the rise of human language, and it's this remarkable adaptation, and it's quite fascinating how it evolved. There, it's sort of I guess it's a more positive look at human adaptations. So
what's the relation between the two?
Well, let's talk first about your work with language. You started that kind of in graduate school, is that correct?
Yes, I started studying language, pretty much started studying in graduate school. I took some linguistics classes as an undergraduate. But when I went to graduate school, I didn't really know exactly what content I wanted to study. I knew how I wanted to study it. I wanted to study something about the mind, about how basically the mind does the tricks that it does. So, always I've had a kind of computer scientist's take on some of these things, like what could the program possibly be? And so I could have continued on with reasoning, or I could have moved to vision. I wanted to study some aspect of how the mind and the brain does what it does. And I went around and I interviewed at different graduate schools across the country, and the person that seemed most interesting to me, who was kind of unknown at the time, was Steve Pinker. Of course, now everybody knows who he is, he's a household name, but at the time, nobody had heard of him. But I saw him give a lecture, and I thought, wow, this is the kind of stuff that I want to do. And he was working on language acquisition, and I figured that graduate school is about being an apprentice to somebody, and he seemed like a great person to be an apprentice to. And
so this was before Pinker had written his books like The Language Instinct and...
That's right. Actually, I remember one day late in graduate school walking to lunch with him, and he said to me, I'm going to write a bestseller. And anybody else, if they tell you that, you're like, well, sure. Steve, you're like, yeah, I bet he could do that. And of course he did. That's sort of like Babe Ruth pointing where he's going to hit the ball. Exactly. It was exactly that.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about sort of what Steven Pinker was doing at that point, and then sort of what you decided to look at in language.
So, what we were looking at together was, in some ways, very narrow and in some ways very grand. So, at a narrow level, what we were looking at is the past tense system of English. So, how do you form the past tense of an irregular verb? Is it sing? Well, so if the stem is sing, is the past tense sang, or is it singed, for example? And children often make mistakes on that. And that was our sort of test case was, why do children sometimes make these mistakes? The broader question that we were looking at was a sort of technical but important question about what is the nature of the sort of components of the mind. So do we have abstract rules, sort of like in algebra? This is sort of how I formulated the question later. Or do we just have sort of networks of neurons that are relatively undifferentiated? And at the time, there was a very popular idea called connectionism or neural network theory, where people were building these very simple models. And they were sort of seductive because they were parsimonious, but I think both Pinker and I felt that they weren't rich enough to really be capturing human cognition. So in a way, we kind of set the bar low. It's like, can you get the past tense right? If you can't get that, you're probably not going to get the rest of syntax. And we tried to make an argument that those models, in fact, would not be able to catch even these basic facts about how children acquired the past tense. And then it also...
So you're talking about sort of a general, all-purpose network of neurons that can kind of learn anything, as opposed to some sort of more specialized.
Exactly.
Can we call this a module?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of interrelated questions there. I mean, you're asking an astute set of questions. So one of the questions that was sort of on the table then was basically a nature-nurture kind of question, where there's a question of how much initial structure do you have. And both Pinker and I are on the side of saying there's some fairly significant initial structure. There's a separate question that people often tie together with that, which is how much of whatever initial structure is there is, say, special to language. And there, I've changed a lot, and that will relate to the question I guess we'll come back to about what's the relation between the two books. And one of them is very, very sort of positive, look at all the amazing things the genome does, and the other is a bit more negative, saying, well, despite all that, we still have problems. But there's this separate question about how much of that stuff is special to language, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the work on the past tense was not necessarily about what was special to language, although we may have thought about it in that way at the time. But it was especially about this sort of nature versus nurture question. Sort of, what is the least amount of structure that you can use in order to build a functioning mind? And there was a hypothesis that was on the table, and I think we gave a pretty convincing argument that the hypothesis was sort of too minimal. It was sort of like a metaphor that I used once is if you were building a radio out of different components, you might want to have like transistors and resistors and capacitors and so forth. And what these neural network people were trying to do was sort of build it all out of wire without having any of these intermediate level components. And so actually this third book that I wrote that you didn't mention is, it was written for a narrow technical audience, but called The Algebraic Mind, and that was published in 2001, and that was some of the work that I did after I finished graduate school. Was specifically about this question of what are the basic building blocks of the mind. And I talked about things like having abstract operations over variables, which in that one respect makes us a lot like computers. I talked about structured representations, so how you can distinguish sort of man bites dog from dog bites man, and then individuals versus kind. So it turns out there's something very basic that we can do, which is we can say, like, this bottle of water versus bottles of water in general. And I tried to, again, argue that some of these connectionist models didn't have enough sort of resources to be able to do that kind of basic computation.
I see. Well, maybe we could talk a bit about the birth of the mind. Maybe you can just sort of give a pretty quick summary of some of the things in there, and then we can head over to Kluge because it's what I find interesting is how in particular is how you've been you've been doing a lot of research in this kind of classic psychology mode, but then you're also doing this computer science stuff, and then you've been working with people who are really expert with genetics and trying to tie what seem like very abstract, forgive the pun, things like language or reasoning to genes, which seems ambitious to me, to say the least. So anyway,
here's my 3-word summary of the birth of the mind, and I'll give you a little bit more. The 3-word summary is Chomsky meets the genome. So the idea was
unpack that for us.
So the idea was that Chomsky has been for many years making all these arguments that
I should back up. This is Noam Chomsky, who a longtime linguist at MIT, and really major figure in modern linguistics. So
exactly.
Sorry.
There used to be, I don't know if it was a true story or a joke, but in the Soviet Union that they referred to Noam Chomsky and then another guy, Noam Chomsky. One was the guy who writes about politics and the other was the guy who writes about linguistics. So I'm referring to the one who writes about linguistics here.
Okay.
So I mean, his core idea is that language requires some kind of important structure built into the child, and Pinker and I are very much working within that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the field of linguistics and language development and cognitive development, which is sort of my day job in some sense, I mean, my daily research is about babies. Well, if you look at that field, often the argument goes blah, 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 therefore either this thing is built into the child or therefore the child has to learn this thing. And when you think about it, all the arguments that end, therefore this is built into the child, are really promissory notes, and they're promissory notes about biology. So when I had my first sabbatical, I decided that I wanted to understand that promissory note, and that's really where the birth of the mind came out. I wanted to say, well, okay, if we're saying that something's innate, well, what's innate? What kind of resources do the genome or the genes have to build innate structure? What kinds of innate structure can they build? How specific can that structure be? How much does building that structure depend on the environment? Questions like that. So that's pretty much what the birth of the mind was about. The connection between the two is that along the way I actually changed my mind about something. So I went into it assuming both that there's a lot of innate structure and that a lot of that structure is special to language. But as I got deeply involved in the biological literature, as I started writing with Simon Fisher, who discovered the FOXP2 gene that's related to the origins of language and so forth, as I started getting into that literature, I realized that I was thinking about this question of what's special about language in the wrong way. When I was in graduate school, we talked about a module, word you used a little bit earlier, for language acquisition. It would be this sort of special purpose, dedicated device that would allow you to acquire language and wouldn't necessarily be good for anything else. And what I figured out, or what dawned on me as I was reading the biology, was that evolution doesn't really work that way. It doesn't say, well, let's start from scratch and let's craft, the perfect communication device. An intelligent designer could do that, an engineer could do that if they had the sort of luxury to think about it, but evolution doesn't have that luxury. And in fact, if you look, say, at our genome versus the chimpanzee genome, they're not really that different. I'm sure you've heard the 98.5% similar statistic, which is basically true, that if you compare nucleotide by nucleotide, our genomes are really quite similar.
Okay, so Gary, after we had a little technological breakdown there, you were talking about your changing
right, the relation.
view
It was a domain
language
specificity and changing views. So I'll sort of overlap with the chimpanzee bit a little bit. So if you look at the genomes of humans and chimpanzees, they're almost identical. They're 98.5% similar. They're made up of pretty much the same nucleotides. Almost every gene in the human genome has a counterpart in the chimpanzee genome and so forth. So there's not enough room in there, and there's also not enough time when you think about it. There's only been something like 100,000 years of language evolution. So our last non-speaking ancestors aren't very far back, and that means that language can't be this thing that's sort of built from scratch, purpose-built to the needs of language. Instead, it has to be something that's built mostly on a framework of stuff that came before. So people sometimes think of Venn diagrams where you have these overlapping circles to indicate the intersection of things. The way I think about it is that most of the circles for language and the rest of sort of human thought have to be overlapping. There's probably an important, very important little bit that's unique to language, but most of it is going to be overlapping stuff. And so that means the right picture of language is not this separate box, but kind of like a box that's been tinkered with in important ways. And that's really what led to Kluge, because that kind of really changed how I thought about what the language acquisition device would be. Like in graduate school, we had this idea that learning to ride a bike and learning language, for example, were two totally different things. And now I think, well, probably everything that we can do in skill learning in general, or nearly everything that we can do in skill learning in general, for example, is also going to contribute to language. But the other point there is I became very impressed by a quote by Francois Jacob, which really dates back to Darwin, that says, evolution is a process. The evolution is like a tinkerer. and it relates to Darwin's notion of descent with modification. So everybody, when they think of Darwin, the first thing they think of is survival of the fittest, which is actually a phrase that he didn't coin. But the phrase that I think he coined, and certainly that he emphasized, was this descent with modification. You build new things by fiddling with old things. And the thing about fiddling is that makes you a tinker, and if you're a tinker, what do you build? You build kluges. And so probably the last chapter that I wrote of The Birth of the Mind, even though it's not the last chapter in the book, is the one about evolution and language and so forth. And by the time I finished that chapter, I'd really changed how I think about how language works and sort of the mind in general. And then I originally planned to write a book just about language evolution, how language was a kludge, but it didn't take too long to realize that was a hammer with which one could strike many nails, that there's a lot of kludgy things about
it's all kludge.
So it's not actually all kludge, but a lot of it's kludge.
There's a lot
Lots
of kludge.
A lot of kludge, yeah.
So remind me again about the word kludge. I'm holding up the cover again. So what's the etymology of that?
That's actually in dispute. I think the smart money is on it coming from a German word, Kluge, which means clever. So even though a kludge is a clumsy solution, it's often a sort of damn clever way of getting something done. So MacGyver is probably like the ultimate kludgist. MacGyver is like, well, I need to be able to run, and what do I have? I have floor mats from a car, and I have duct tape. I'm going to wrap them around each other and make shoes. So that's a fine example of a kludge, and it's also very clever. So my guess is that's probably where the term came from. It became very popular in like the 1950s and 60s. My dad, who went to MIT, learned it there, and I picked it up from him. There are some other stories about the possible etymology. There's a Scottish word that basically means outhouse, and you could construct a little story around that. And then there was I think a paper feeder that was made by a guy named Kluge that probably didn't work very well, and that may have contributed. So nobody really knows for sure, but I think once you know the word, you just kind of see examples of it all the time.
Right. I mean, I like the example you gave on the Apollo 13 mission, where you have this rocket to the moon. That's this incredible piece of engineering that took many people many years to plan out and then to build, and then something goes awry, and what is it they had to build? A new air filter, was it?
It was really an adapter for an air filter. I don't know if anybody saw out there in Viewerland saw the movie that Ron Howard put together, but I thought it was actually the best scene of the movie. So the head of engineering, I think his name was Ron Smyrna or something like that, comes out to his crew and he says, unfortunately, all of the astronauts, as you know, are stuck on this space capsule. They had to eject from the main ship, and they're running out of air. And there was sort of good news and bad news. The good news was there were some air filters that they had from the other ship that they brought over to the capsule or something like that. But the bad news was that the only thing that they could use as an outlet to make things didn't match. And so they sort of had them, but they couldn't work. And so the great scene in the movie is he spills a box of stuff, and he says, I need you to take all the stuff in this box, and spills it out on the table, and figure out a way to sort of connect A with item B, and you have to do it in the next 4 hours or 24 hours, or the astronauts are going to die. And that, so all they could possibly do was build a kludge. So they took like socks and duct tape and the air filter they already had, and they put it together. And I actually quote in the book Jim Lavelle. He said, something like, it wasn't very elegant, or it wasn't very handsome, but it worked.
Right.
That's the spirit of kludge. You get home. If you had time to think about it, you'd say, well, that's really not a good idea to have your space capsule have air filters that don't work, but or CO2 filters. But you're in this position where you have to build something right away. Now, evolution, it's a little bit different, but it winds up in the same place, which is for evolution. Evolution can't take things offline. It can't say, if we started over, we could build a great human mind or a great human spine or whatever. Because evolution is all about the perpetuation of genes now. So evolution's sort of like the worst kind of engineers that always have a deadline. We got to ship the product now and never get to say, well, could we do it better? Evolution's got this constant pressure to sort of move forward, but sometimes you take these little steps and they don't actually advance you towards a bigger goal or even take you further away. And that's sort of what the book is about, is the consequences of that for the human mind.
I see. And so you're able to go back, say, to that experiment about about firefighters, or to these other experiments on that have to do with belief or language or reason, and where we discover all these amazing, disturbing almost shortcomings of how we go about thinking about things, and then it's a powerful explanation to think of these things as klugers.
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that the only way to get a handle on why we have the sort of different bugs that we have, the different foibles, is to think about, well, in evolutionary history, how could these things have come about? So, I mean, part of the book is simply almost like a list of, these are the bugs that I have found in researching the human mind. But the more interesting part of the book is that I try to explain them. I try to figure out, why did they exist? A lot of them I trace towards the nature of human memory. And I try to argue that the kind of memory that we use for the things that we think of as most human, like language and deliberate reasoning and so forth, is kind of like a clumsy tool for the job. It's sort of like evolution is using a screwdriver where a hammer would be better. And so I try to go through, first of all, why memory evolved the way that it did. The short version is every species on the planet has this kind of memory where instead of knowing where in the brain a particular bit of information is, they use cues or reminders that help them sort of zero in on something like what they're looking for relatively quickly.
So we're even talking about like a snail that might associate a painful shock with a light going off or something like that.
Exactly. I mean, I actually give a reference to a paper by a snail showing this phenomenon, and papers by fruit flies and so forth. I mean, it's really everywhere in the animal world. You might call it something like content addressable memory. I mean, you have to use sort of technical terms to describe it, but it contrasts with a computer where everything is mapped out in advance. So you assign particular locations for particular things that you want to store in memory. And so a computer might be sort of made transparent to the programmer, but ultimately the way that the computer is working is everything has its specific location, and you retrieve things by going to those locations. And one of the running themes in the book is if we had that kind of memory, we wouldn't get into a lot of the trouble that we actually get into. So a lot of the things that we do that I think are a bit peculiar, I think we do because we don't have the level of control over memory that computers do. So I give examples in pretty much all of the things that you mentioned, in belief, in memory, in language, and so forth. There's a chapter about mental disorders. In each one of those, I give several examples where I think that the underlying problem is that there's this mismatch between the memory circuitry that we use and the thing you need to be accomplished. So for a sort of random example, but one of my favorites is this 2-question survey. I love a sort of simple, elegant experiment. And so here's the study. You ask people either... you ask the following 2 questions, but the order matters. So some people you say, how happy would you say you are with your life in general? And then you say, how many dates have you had lately? And if you ask in that order, there's no particular relation between the answers that people give. You can have a lot of dates and not be happy, or the other way around, and so forth. But if I ask you how many dates have you had lately, and then how happy are you with your life in general, and especially like if you're an undergraduate, then you're likely to base your answer to how happy you are with your life in general based on the number of dates that you've had. And the problem with that is that, a question like how happy are you with your own life in general shouldn't be so sort of easy to tamper with, right? I mean, the order in which I ask experiments shouldn't, affect your own sense of self, but it does. And that's a very general phenomenon, so that's a sort of cute demonstration of it. But almost anything, like the last thing that we hear, has a huge impression on us because of the way that our memories are organized and the fact that we can't sort of search them systematically in the ways that computers can. So the same thing can happen, for example, in politics. Like, we can have an 18-month-long election campaign, and I'm willing to bet that the last thing that happens will matter disproportionately relative to everything else. So, when people go to the polls, what's going to be on their mind is, the scandal from 3 days ago rather than all of the stuff they saw in the, 7 debates and, 2 years of newspaper articles.
Probably explain some of those late-breaking scandals that just have a way of surfacing right before people have to make a decision.
I mean, the spin doctors know a lot about human psychology, right? And one thing that they exploit is our familiarity, or our dependence on the last thing that happened. Another thing that's related is the way that our memory structures work is cueing really matters. So the way in which something is framed, and George Lakoff has talked a lot about this, but I talk in the book about how it relates to evolution and how memory works. We're very susceptible to framing. So, you've got death tax versus the estate tax. Well, that's an astute piece of psychology, because the way that you respond when you hear death tax is it brings out one set of kinds of ideas, and estate tax brings out another. It's the same thing, but our memories are structured to pull up a different set of memories. So, now, if you were building a deliberate reasoning system from scratch, you might want it to sort of balance for that and say, well, I realize that the framing is going to matter. I really want to have a balanced set of ideas when I evaluate this political question or whatever. And you can teach yourself to do that a bit, but there's sort of nothing that's built into the hardware that requires us to do that. So that's another example where I think things are kind of klugey. We've got these fancy mechanisms for doing deliberate reasoning and logic and so forth, but they're drawing on this database that was designed really to decide how much food is on this side of the mountain. And that system is good at sort of statistical stuff, but it's not good at balance and systematicity.
So, do you... This is a sort of complicated question, but there are a lot of evolutionary psychologists who will look at the mind as being this very well adapted set of structures that is well adapted for life out in the savannah over the course of 1 million or 2 years. And this ancestral environment. And then suddenly we've been kind of thrown into the modern world, and we're just using this old-fashioned system to kind of navigate our way through modern civilization. And so there's a mismatch there. Whereas, I think, a lot of what you seem to be saying in the book is that you have these ancestral things in the mind, and they've been tinkered with so that they are actually... in some ways, they are biologically different than what apes had, but because they're built on this old foundation, that you can't just sort of do it from scratch. They work pretty well, but they have a lot of flaws that have to do with they're just little modifications. So I guess I'm wondering about first I'm wondering if what I just said is true, but I'm also wondering. So logic. So do you see logic as an adaptation in the human brain, or is it just something that our very versatile brains have sort of stumbled across in the past couple thousand years, and we're just trying to use these little inference engines in our heads to do logic? Does that make sense?
So I guess you're actually asking about a couple of different points.
Yeah.
One is sort of what's the relation between what I'm arguing in evolutionary psychology in general, and then the other is taking logic as a test case. What do you make of that?
Yes.
So at the broader level, I would say that in some ways I'm very sympathetic to what evolutionary psychologists do, which is to try to figure out why the mind is the way that it is by looking to our evolution. So the broad agenda I'm very sympathetic with. But I think that there's often an assumption that whatever we do, it was optimal for some environment. And I'm not sure that's actually true. And I'm giving a lot of cases where I think that maybe wouldn't be optimal for any environment. And I think what's been left out of a lot of evolutionary psychology, although not evolution in general, is this idea that history can lead you astray. So Darwin looked at it when he talked about the vestiges that are sort of useless things in evolution, and Stephen Jay Gould talked about remnants of history and the panda's thumb and stuff like that. I'm trying to carry that idea over into evolutionary psychology. And I think evolutionary psychologists are aware of it. I mean, they've read, Gould's stuff on the panda's thumb and so forth. But the way that the field has been structured sociologically, there hasn't been much attention to that. So all the emphasis has been on what we do well. And just for different sociological or political or historical reasons, people haven't looked at the limits. And you don't get a fair picture unless you look at both. So, there are things that are pretty darn good, like our visual systems are remarkable. But then... things that are more recent, like language and logic, there hasn't been as much time to evolve them, and so there's more evolutionary inertia, is a phrase I like to use. There's more inertia in place, leading you to a different direction that might not be the most useful one. So evolutionary inertia is modeled. I mean, it's a term that I use modeled on Newton's law that says an object that's in motion tends to stay in motion, an object at rest tends to stay at rest. And a lot of the book is about saying, look, the design of the mind, if you will, I mean, it's not really a design, but the structure of the mind was sort of in one direction, and suddenly doing language and deliberate reasoning is a very different direction. There's a lot of inertia to overcome, and we haven't done it so well. Mm-hmm. So in the specific case of logic, I would say that we have some of the basis for learning logic built in, but I wouldn't say that, especially like deductive language, like if P then Q, P therefore Q, I wouldn't say that that's like a core part of our biological program. It's something that we can acquire, but it's more like reading than language. So spoken language, everybody acquires it automatically, whereas reading, you have to do a lot of training in order to do it. And I think that the cross-cultural research suggests that logic is that way, that it's a learnable skill, but it takes some practice to do it right, and people forget to do it even when it never gets to be as good as reading, which eventually becomes a reflex. I think when it comes to logic and reasoning, all of us, even trained scientists, for example, are susceptible to biases where we notice things that confirm our theories and we're too dismissive of things that go against them and so forth. In the case of logic, there's actually some cross-cultural work. I cite one of my favorite studies in the book, which was Alexander Luria went into Uzbekistan, I think, or someplace in that general area, and he went around asking people these syllogisms like, all polar bears are white, this is a polar bear, do you think it's white? And their answer was sort of like, why are you asking me these questions? I just couldn't, they couldn't engage it. Why doesn't Professor Luria go, up to Siberia? Sorry, I guess I messed it up. It was all polar bears in Siberia are white. This particular polar bear is in Siberia. Do you think it's white? And their answer was basically something like, well, Professor Luria, why don't you go there and find out for yourself? So not everybody even engages in the stuff that we would recognize as formal logic. And then even on the informal logic side, people are not intuitively very good at it. And one of the things that I recommend at the end of the book is that we should actually spend more of our educational resources teaching people about their own limitations on reasoning skills and so forth, so that they can do better. I think a lot of school is still taken up with people memorizing dates and stuff like that anybody can look up on Wikipedia. But what we really need to know is the limits of our own mind so that we can work around them. Informal reasoning, I think, is a good example of that.
It was very interesting reading your book. I was actually thinking back to the evolutionary biologist George Williams, his work in the 1960s. In a sense, a lot of the evolutionary psychology today kind of comes out of some of his basic ideas, where he was arguing how natural selection could be responsible for a lot of features of life that had been thought of as being things that had evolved for the good of the species or something like that. And Williams was saying, a lot of these things are probably just individuals with mutations, and they're competing with each other for reproductive success, and so these are all fitness enhancing traits, like why fish school together. So among biologists, Williams, I think, is really most famous for that. But he was also really interested in, well, I guess you could say today, he was interested in Kluges, and he was, he helped start up this whole area called evolutionary medicine, basically saying, okay, why is the human body so maladapted? And I think there's been a lot of this kind of Kluge type thinking with anatomy. I don't think there's been that much with psychology as much.
Yeah, that's exactly my point, is that people know that this is how biology works, and George Williams certainly is one of the foremost evolutionary scholars. And a lot of the ideas that people think of as Dawkins and the selfish gene really kind of derived out of Williams, as Dawkins acknowledged. And yeah, he was full of these examples, and Gould was full of these examples. Like, why is the tube in the penis going wrapped around itself 3 times, and when you could have a straighter pathway and so forth. So it's not like it's mysterious that there are Kluges in biology. I certainly didn't invent that notion at all. What's mysterious is why nobody really applied it seriously to the human mind before.
Any theories?
Any theories? Well, I do have a theory. The theory has to do with our own sense of self and with intelligent design and with a kind of backlash in evolution. So let me spell that out. I mean, you and I live in a country where scientists sort of have to defend their beliefs in evolution all the time, which I think is a bit absurd in this era. And they don't have to do that necessarily about animals. They have to do that about human beings. Like, a lot of people can kind of accept that, monkeys evolved, but they really kind of want to draw the line at human beings. And then, even if they'll accept that our bodies are the product of evolution, they kind of want, the mind to be off limits. They want to talk about the spirit or something like that. There's been a strong trend, I think, in human history for us to try to maybe make ourselves more special than I think we really are. And any working scientist kind of comes up against this when they think about evolution. I think evolutionary psychologists may have kind of gone overboard in the other direction. So one of the arguments for intelligent design is supposed to be the perfection of man. And so a lot of the evolutionary psychologists have tried to say, well, yeah, you can get perfect things from evolution too. Mm-hmm. The classic example of this is for the eye. So Paley, as you probably know, used the eye's beauty as an example of the supreme wisdom of the Creator, and then people like Richard Dawkins have turned that around and said, well, actually, here's how evolution can give you something so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And what's happened to the literature is, over and over again, people point to those examples, and they're all good examples. I mean, it's true that the eye is the product of evolution, and there's lots of interesting things that you can say about it, and it's true that things that look like they're perfect don't need to be designed, and evolution is a powerful process that sometimes can make things that are perfect. But it doesn't always do that, and the cases where evolution stumbles have sort of gotten in the psychological literature left behind, maybe because people don't want to admit it, maybe because the way the literature has gone is that just people have to feel like they have to emphasize how powerful evolution is in order to get anybody to believe it. Mm. But I always think that actually the Kluges are the most interesting cases. I think Darwin felt that way. I think Williams felt that way to some extent. I think especially Stephen Jay Gould did.
Yeah, George Williams actually wrote about, he would write about the eye, and he would talk about it in terms of, how well adapted it is, and then he would turn around and say, on the other hand,
it's installed backwards.
Yeah, the photoreceptors are pointing backwards instead of forwards, like in this camera I'm looking into, and
exactly.
You've got your blind spots, and your retina can detach, and all that.
Exactly. I mean, that's a perfect example of why you really need both the kind of optimistic work that a lot of evolutionary psychology provides and the sort of more curmudgeonly thing that my book provides. I mean, mm-hmm. Even when you look at a single system like the eye or the way that the DNA unwinds, you often find pockets of supreme elegance and pockets of supreme stupidity. Mm-hmm. And a real picture's got to have both. You've got to understand both what we do well and what we don't do well and why we don't do those things well. I try to address that balance a bit.
Well, let's talk a bit about language again. So, I mean, people like Steven Pinker and others have said, okay, here's my idea about how language evolved. It evolved because it was it raised reproductive success because individuals could communicate with each other to do things like hunt and to share knowledge about where food was and so on. And there
are a lot of theories of that form. I'm not sure that Pinker commits to any particular one. There are like the theories about language as evolving from gossip and as a way of doing gossip, as a way of doing hunting, as cooperation, and so forth. I think that Pinker just emphasizes that it's good for communication in general.
Okay.
There's certainly a lot of arguments in the literature of that general form of here's the thing that language evolved for.
Right, and I mean, we're having this conversation here. I mean, obviously, language is incredibly powerful and versatile. Mm-hmm. So where does language fall short, as you see it?
I think the biggest place is that language falls short because our sentences are often more ambiguous than we realize. It's one thing to make sentences that are deliberately ambiguous, so you don't want to give somebody a straight answer, and that's a useful thing. But human languages almost all have this property that there are sentences like, the spy shot the cop with the revolver, where you don't know whether the dude with the revolver is the spy or the cop. And you don't have to do that, and there's actually a very simple solution. So this is, I think, parallel to what we were just talking about in the eye a minute ago. There's these wonderful things about the eye, and then it's installed backwards. So there are lots of wonderful things about language. I mean, language is my stock in trade. I love language, but at the same time, why do you have these ambiguities? And the reason that it seems sort of almost boneheaded is because no computer language has inadvertent ambiguity, no mathematical language does, and the solution even is really simple. All you would need is basically parentheses or brackets or something like that to mark off what goes with what. And yet, that never evolved. And my argument for why it never evolved goes back to the memory structures, that even if you actually had the parentheses, our brains just aren't good at keeping track of that level of detail. And so we wouldn't be able to know where we are in the parentheses. And in fact, anybody that's ever programmed in a computer programming language like Lisp has probably seen these long strings of parentheses, and you have to have the computer help the programmer to know which ones match up with which. One of the things I talk about in the book that's little known but I think is really interesting was a guy in the 1950s tried to create a perfect language. He said, well, okay, human languages are ambiguous and so forth. Can we do something about that? And he was interested in the hypothesis you might know called the Worf hypothesis, which says that the way that you speak influences the way that you think. And so he thought, I know, I'll build a perfect language and I'll see whether people become less sloppy thinkers, basically. It's a brilliant experiment. You can read about it in the book, or you can look up Logland on the web. Is a brilliant idea for an experiment, and the only problem was nobody could actually learn the language. Right? Our brains just aren't cut out to learn perfect languages. So, people have tried, and all they can do is sort of have short telephone conversations. It's not a good fit to the human mind because the structure of our memories, or at least I would hypothesize, because the structures of our memory don't support these sort of simple things. So it's very much like the eye. Lots of things that are perfect, and then these sort of very puzzling things like, well, why would you have ambiguity? And the only answer, I think, is you got to look at the underlying memory structures and how the brain was built. And when you do that, then you can say, now I see. Now I see why this particular aspect of language doesn't make sense. And there are other things too, like we have this very complicated system for moving our muscles at the same time to produce sounds, and we can get sort of 100 bits per second, which is kind of cool, but when you compare it to like how fast a computer modem works, it's not really using the auditory channel for all it's worth. We'd probably be better off if we had sort of like iPods in our throats that could modulate the sound at 44,000 cycles per second. Then we could transmit a lot more information. Now, shortly that would be adaptive, right? It would be a human that actually had that built in, and if you could set up all the wiring, right, and so forth, and had someone else who was wired up to understand it, could communicate a lot more information. And sometimes communicating more information in a brief period of time is really helpful. So that's a case where it would be adaptive to do something differently. But again, you have to start over. And evolution was working with a system that was basically designed for chewing and swallowing and stuff like that, and it had to tinker with that rather than saying, okay, well, let's think about this. What would be the best way to communicate? Evolution couldn't do that.
Yeah. I've been sort of struck by how some of the most elaborate adaptations in the brain are kind of overcoming these kinds of shortcomings. I just wrote this piece about how just the way that the basic biology of our neurons makes them really noisy. I mean, just that all these signals get scrambled because the channels that control the voltages, they're open when they should be closed, or closed when they should be open, and I mean, it's just a terrible way to send a signal. And so you have all these like beautiful structures in the brain where you send a signal down these different neurons, and so some scientists just think that this is a way to filter out some of that noise, which is just biology.
Yeah, I mean, biology is full of these cases where you've got a sort of, clumsy solution. You build another clumsy thing on top of it, and a third one, which is again what the engineer does when they got to ship the car tomorrow and they can't wait to redesign it. So, I mean, over and over you see this, that there are things that sort of work really well and things that don't, which is, I mean, I think the strongest reason for not believing in something like intelligent design is you have these things where you scratch your head and you're like, why would you do that? And the only explanation is that the process that built us just doesn't have foresight. You wouldn't do it that way if you had foresight, or even if you had a decent amount of hindsight, you could look and say, why did the wiring work that way? Maybe I could do better.
Right.
Evolution's just not equipped to do that.
Right. It can't quite upgrade like that.
It can't do overhauls. It can only do sort of, incremental upgrades. You can get the, 1.01 version, but you can't say, we really got to start over here. We got to, ditch the operating system and start over. Evolution can't do it.
Okay, so which is more like the human mind then, Windows Vista or Macs?
With Windows or Mac?
Yeah.
Ooh. Do I have to answer that one on the record?
No. I'm just trying to put you on the spot. There are a couple things I just wanted to make sure we talked about before we were done. And one is that at the end of the book, you talk a bit about how thinking about kludges can make us understand what happens when the mind kind of goes awry. I mean, so you're laying out this case that the mind works in these kind of quirky, far from perfect ways in the best of health, but then, of course there are all these psychological disorders. So how does kludge thinking help you with those?
With the mental disorders?
Mm-hmm.
Here's a case where I have to be really careful not to use my hammer and see everything as a nail. I think that the metaphor of a kludge can help a bunch, and I talk about that. I don't think it gives a complete answer. I think there are all kinds of processes that contribute to mental disorder, but part of what I do there is to say people have these theories about how mental disorders have their adaptive benefits. And some of them might be true, but some of our mental disorders, I think, flow from some of the fundamental flaws in the human mind. They're sort of accidents waiting to happen. Mm-hmm. So this stuff I was talking about with memory is a good example. So our memories are designed to really sort of dwell on the most recent thing that happened. And sometimes that's handy and sometimes it's not. In a case of, say, depression, it can lead to what I call ruminative cycles. So what happens is, if somebody's in a bad mood, they notice things that are bad because memory is structured to give you other things that are in the same context. And that just makes you think about more negative things, and you go out of control. Mm-hmm. The same thing happens with paranoia. If you notice, there's an old saying, even paranoids have real enemies. If you have a couple of real enemies, then you start noticing the things that fuel your fire for paranoia. And then because our mind has this confirmation bias and is also very adept at denying evidence that goes against our hypotheses, someone can easily grow steadily more paranoid. Their partner might say, I think really you should look at it this way. I don't think these people meant to do this. But you start to get invested in the hypothesis that, that everybody's out to get you, and then the next thing you know, you're dismissing all of the evidence that might contradict that. Mm-hmm. And that's a general property of the human mind. So another example of that that's not on mental disorders but makes the point nicely is when they first released, the Surgeon General had his first report about how cigarette smoking causes cancer. All of the people who were non-smokers that were interviewed in one study said, I guess that makes sense. I can understand. There's all these toxic chemicals and so forth. And the people who were smokers were like, well, I wonder how good the studies were, and, smoking can kill you, but lots of other things can too. I'm not really worried about it. It's not going to affect me. And so people are really good at dismissing evidence, and I think that actually is in itself a kludge. We sort of have this powerful tool for analyzing data, but we don't engage it fairly. We sort of engage it when it will help our self-esteem, and otherwise we let it go to sleep and we watch television or something like that. So the fact that the brain can be sort of almost, what's the word I'm looking for? That the brain can be exploited to behave in this biased fashion that makes us think that our own hypotheses, however loopy they might be, are correct. And that goes back to the firefighter study we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. That's another thing that makes mental disorders sort of accidents waiting to happen. I don't think it's enough by itself, but it really can sort of add fuel to the fire. Mm-hmm. So there's a chapter in the book called Things Fall Apart, and a lot of it is about sort of the cases where with better design we might not be vulnerable to certain things in the first place. You're always probably going to have some environmental trigger, and there might be some specific genetic anomaly and so forth, but the thesis of that chapter is that a lot of mental illness is sort of made possible in the first place because of design flaws in the human mind. If you could correct those flaws, if you could get people to be more objective in different ways and so forth, then they would be less likely to fall into a ruminative cycle or a paranoid cycle and so forth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And it was interesting how you were actually able to come up with some suggestions for how to deal with our kludgy minds. I mean, to take some of this basic science and try to turn it into a little advice. I mean, maybe we could talk about a couple of them. I mean, one thing you were suggesting was, in a sense, taking this this way we have our minds have of being primed so easily, and just turning it to your advantage to just remind yourself of things like that you need about reasoning or so on. I mean, maybe you can obviously say it better than I can rehash it.
Yeah, I think you're probably referring to sort of the silliest suggestion, but one that I think actually works, which is to remind oneself to be rational. It sounds like the dumbest piece of advice you could possibly imagine. It's sort of like buy low, sell high. How could that possibly help? But there's actually studies that show that it can help, and the reason that it can help is, as you're saying, because of the way that the mind is structured, the way that memory is structured. If you tell yourself to be rational, it's probably not going to work on its own, but if you develop some other techniques to consider alternative hypotheses and so forth, then telling yourself to be rational can prime those techniques and make you more likely to do those kinds of things. There's another example that sort of works similarly, which is actually my favorite, which is to make specific contingency plans. So another theme in the book is a kind of split between ancestral mechanisms that work by reflex and modern mechanisms that allow us to sort of think more carefully, make longer-term plans. We have both of these systems as an idea that goes back to Freud, although I think it's much more general than Freud recognized. We have both of these systems, but they're not very well integrated. So, I mean, what's characteristic of our species is we can sort of make these long-term plans, New Year's resolutions, and so forth. We're smart enough to do that, but we're often dumb enough to just blow them off at a moment's notice. You know, we see the chocolate cake and we're like, was I on a diet? Or we're not even like that. We just eat the chocolate and we don't even think about the diet. So what I think is one of the most powerful suggestions in the book, and I'm drawing on my colleague Peter Gowitzer's research here, is to try to translate between the two and say, well, here's my abstract goal. How can I turn that into something that the reflexive system understands? Well, the currency of the reflexive system is basically sort of circumstance and action. So if something is true, then do something. If I find myself in this position, there's cake on the table and I'm at a dinner party, at a restaurant, then instead of looking at the cake, I'll engage people in a conversation. Well, if you do that, you might actually resist the cake. And sure, you would enjoy the cake for a moment, but the long-term thing is you want to lose weight and so forth. You would make more progress towards the long-term goal if you got yourself in the habit of thinking, if I'm in these specific conditions, I do these specific things. So the ancestral system isn't clever enough to sit there at the moment when you're in an interesting conversation at the restaurant and say, I really shouldn't eat that dessert, because your attention is focused on the people that you're having dinner with and so forth. So the idea is, take advantage of what we know about the limitations of the mind and the strengths of the mind and try to work with that and work within the constraints that we've got. One thing that I mentioned in the book that I think is really applicable is this line that's popular in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is recognition is the first step. If you can realize the things that we do wrong, you can make something of it. You can find ways to work around it. You can out-kluge your inner kluge.
My name is Carl, and I have a kluge. So come
That's right.
forward.
That's right.
Okay, I will try that.
We all do.
All right. Well, looks like we have come to the end. So,
All right.
So thanks
Well,
a
thank
lot,
you very
Gary.
much.
And,
Thank you very much.
Let's talk again soon.
Absolutely.
All
Okay.
right. Take care.